I'd like to discuss some principles of logic that are essential in properly evaluating arguments for or against the existence of God, for or against the Bible, for or against the teachings of Jesus Christ, indeed, any sort of religious or anti-religious belief. One reason why there's so much confusion regarding these issues is because people often use very sloppy logic. They reason from their gut instead of going by what is strictly logical. And that is true of both believers and non-believers. I'd like to discuss some examples, two examples in particular, that have come up in the course of the videos I presented. These are fallacies that come up in the various angry responses to my videos. And I'd like to emphasize that even Christians are guilty of the same thing. So even though these examples are focusing on some of the atheistic, hostile, skeptical responses, I'm equally disappointed when believers use this type of faulty reasoning. One of them is the fallacy known as affirming the consequent. It's one that I've discussed previously, but I want to revisit. Another is the fallacy known as hasty generalization. And there are a great many, but I want to discuss these two because they're somewhat related. Affirming the consequent. That's the fallacy of saying that A implies B, and B is true, therefore A must be true. It comes up all the time, in particular in my discussions regarding Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and how it uses very faulty logic to argue for God's existence. Here's what happens. I pointed out various examples of how Richard Dawkins uses very faulty arguments and really very poor philosophy in arguing against the existence of God. And I've even cited atheistic philosophers, experts in their field, who agree with that. I also point out that there's been a severe lack of support from the scholarly philosophical community for his book. Why? Because it does use such incredibly sloppy argumentation. I'm not going to rehash those arguments right now since they're available in various reviews on the web as well as in the videos I presented previously. A great many people responded by saying, "You haven't proven that God doesn't exist. You have not proven that God exists. See, so you're wrong." In other words, the argument goes as follows. I argue that Dawkins used faulty logic, but they say, but Dawkins is still right, or alternatively, you haven't proven that he's wrong. The implication being that my critique of his arguments must therefore be in error. That simply does not follow. That is called affirming the consequent. It is perfectly possible for his arguments to be wrong and yet his conclusion to be correct anyway. As the cliche goes, even a stop clock is correct twice a day. The purpose of those videos, after all, was simply to critique his argumentation. I did not purport to dismiss his conclusion. That's something I chose to address in other videos wherein I argued specifically for the existence of God. I say this because some people argued that I was sort of dodging that issue. No, I wasn't. I specifically argued for the existence of God and presented certain reasons why I believe in it. I did that in other videos simply because it's not possible to cover all that material in the course of a few minutes. You got to take this in bite-sized chunks. My point here is to emphasize that the issue of the validity of his logic is somewhat separate from the issue of whether he arrived at the correct conclusion anyway. If he did arrive at the correct conclusion, it was by happenstance only, and not because his reasoning was correct. So you cannot argue that God does not exist, therefore his logic was sound. That simply does not follow. That is known as affirming the consequent. I don't believe he was right in either his conclusion or his logic, by the way. This other argument is the argument known as hasty generalization, where they'll say, people will point to, say, Christians who were guilty of all sorts of atrocities, and they'll say, see, this proves what a terrible, lousy thing Christianity is. You cannot generalize from the actions of certain Christians, even certain Christian denominations, and conclude that Christianity itself is this horrible system that systematically murders people. That's like arguing that because Lenin and Stalin killed people and they're atheists, we must therefore blame all atheists. That's hasty generalization. Here's another example of how that was applied. As I said, there's been a severe lack of support from the atheistic philosophers for Dawkins' book. Why? Because his reasoning is amateurish it was a shallow treatment, used very sloppy logic, his conclusions simply did not follow, and so forth and so on. Uh, One gentleman responded by saying, "What do you mean? What do you mean? There's been tremendous support from atheistic philosophers, atheistic scholars for his book." And I asked, "How do you know that? On what basis do you make that claim?" And he said, "Well, see, I attended an atheism conference, and people applauded his book. They cheered for it. And surely there were some scholars in attendance. Therefore, that is how I know that atheistic scholars had great support for his book." Now that support is flawed in multiple ways. One of the most obvious ways is that it's a hasty generalization. You cannot argue that a lot of people applauded his book at that conference. Therefore, atheistic scholars in attendance also applauded the book. It simply does not follow. It could very well be that the atheistic scholars in attendance simply kept quiet. Even if they did applaud the book, it could be that they were applauding the conclusion rather than the logic. For all you know, they had not actually read the book. I'm not saying that they did not read the book. I'm not saying that no atheistic scholars applauded the book. What I'm saying is that the conclusion does not follow. Why? Because it's an example of hasty generalization. People do that all the time when it comes to Christianity, where they paint a broad stereotype of Christians. More than once, I've had people respond to my videos by saying, "How can you possibly believe that the earth was created in only 6 days?" etc., etc. Well, not all Christians believe that sort of thing. I have said nothing about my personal beliefs on that matter. And how do I put it this way? In the interest of fairness, as I said, I'm equally disappointed when Christians paint atheists with the same broad brush, or paint people of other religions with the same broad brush. We have to be very careful in that regard. If I show frustration in dealing with these fallacies, I hope you'll be understanding. Because it does get very frustrating, especially when I've pointed these things out over and over again. I want to be very careful in how I say this, because I don't want to be needlessly demeaning. But you have to wonder sometimes when people use this type of sloppy reasoning. I'm inclined to believe that when people use this type of sloppy reasoning, it's often because they're not really thinking things through, and they're just reacting from their gut. I know that sounds condescending, but I want to emphasize even Christians do the same thing. It's how people generally reason. Most people do not reason in a strictly logical fashion, especially when it comes to matters that are near and dear to our hearts. I'd like to be able to evaluate the reasoning of atheists, but do so in a dispassionate way, regardless of whether I agree with them or not. Incidentally, this is one reason why I choose to moderate the comments on my videos. I know some of you guys don't like that, but I do because, first of all, when it comes to very poor, sloppy logic, I might address it somewhat, but I don't seem to see any point in having protracted discussion on the matter. The second reason is because sometimes these points are raised over and over again, and it really contributes nothing to the discussion, especially when I address these fallacies within the videos themselves, or especially when they raise points that I already addressed in the videos. I like to keep the discussions as profitable as possible. I know that not everyone's going to be happy with that, but not everyone's going to be happy with the approach of moderating those comments, but I feel that it's helpful and necessary to keep the discussions relatively on track, even if other people become angry and dissatisfied. And I hope that you'll understand, even if you disagree with my call on that matter. So, careful reasoning is something that I think is necessary for everyone, whether you're defending or attacking Christianity. I just tackled a couple of those examples. I hope they didn't offend too many people, but I think those are very clear examples of fallacious reasoning.